Hey guys, tonight we begin with the wonderful disaster known as being a teenager in ancient Rome. A time when adulthood started at 13 and fashion was just fabric draped with confidence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Your life as a Roman teenager begins with the one thing Rome excels at, noise so loud it could wake the dead. Before the sun even stretches its golden little fingers over the horizon, the city has already declared war on your sleep. The first sound, your neighbor yelling at his mule. Why? Because the mule has opinions, and it's expressing them loudly on cobblestone at dawn. You haven't even opened your eyes yet, and you already know today is going to be a Roman kind of day, chaotic and slightly disappointing. If you're wealthy, you wake in a villa so beautiful that even the gods would envy your mosaic floors. But don't get too comfortable. That gorgeous open-air design also means your house is basically a wind tunnel with expensive decor. Your servant gently taps your shoulder awake with the energy of someone who gave up on their dreams long ago. They whisper, "Young master, it is time." What they really mean is, please wake up before the rooster starts screaming again. If you're poor, your sleeping situation is more flexible. You share a room with enough siblings to populate a small legion. Your mattress is straw, and you know it's morning because your brother just rolled off his half and onto your face. The rooster is screaming outside. The neighbor is arguing about bread prices already. And you seriously consider inventing the modern door just to shut out the noise. The smell of Rome hits you next, a cocktail of olive oil, warm, bread, incense, smoke, sweat, and whatever mystery liquid your upstairs neighbor threw out the window last night. Privacy, never heard of her. Peace. She moved away years ago. Your feet hit the floor. Cool terracotta tiles for the upper class. Cool packed dirt for everyone else. Either way, it's cold enough to make you question all your life choices. You stumble through a maze of random household objects, jugs, baskets, sandals, your father's tools, and at least one cat that refuses to move because it is in its own mind a minor deity. And then, as if on cue, the city cranks the volume up another level. Vendors shouting about fresh fruit that definitely isn't fresh. Bakers bragging about their bread as if it's a political achievement. Street children running around like caffeinated centurions. This is your morning. This is Rome, a city that doesn't gently wake you. It grabs you by the tunic and says, "Rise, shine, survive." Breakfast in ancient Rome is underwhelming. Calling it a meal is generous. It's more of a suggestion, a whisper of food, a small edible gesture to convince your stomach not to file a complaint with the gods. You shuffle into the main room of your home, still half asleep and already annoyed at the world. Outside, the streets roar with life. But inside, your family is preparing the Roman breakfast, which has the nutritional excitement of a beige wall. If you're from a wealthy family, your breakfast might include bread dipped in honey, dried fruit, olives, maybe some cheese. Basically snack food your rich uncle pretends is light and elegant, when in reality it barely registers as sustenance. Slaves bring the food out with the look of people who know you're about to complain no matter what they serve. If you're from a poorer family, your breakfast is simpler, much simpler. Bread. Just bread, possibly hard bread. The kind of bread that if thrown at someone could cause permanent emotional damage. You may soften it in watered wine, the Roman version of life hack, but it still tastes like regret with notes of grape. And speaking of wine, yes, Romans drink watered wine in the morning. Not because they're trying to get tipsy before lunch, but because water in Rome has the personality of a questionable pond. The teenagers of Rome drink diluted wine and call it hydration. Meanwhile, modern parents panic if their kid has too much caffeine. The family gathers around the table, which is really just a plank of wood pretending to be furniture. Your father is already discussing politics, taxes, or that neighbor who looked at him funny last week. Your mother is mentally planning the entire day, cleaning, ritual duties, shopping, and reminding you to behave in public, a full-time job. If you're a wealthy teen, you eat your breakfast while a slave stands nearby, holding your shoes, waiting for you to finish so they can help you tie the straps. If you're poor, your mother tosses your sandals at you from across the room with the accuracy of a trained centurion. And then you go outside. The smell of breakfast, mostly bread, olives, and light disappointment, drifts behind you as the full aroma of Rome hits you square in the face. Street food sizzling, animals wandering, someone yelling about fresh fish, someone else yelling that he's lying, and a beggar arguing with a pigeon. Breakfast is done, fuel acquired, Rome awaits, and yes, it's already yelling. In ancient Rome, there is no such thing as a teenage phase. No adolescence, no gentle transition from childhood to adulthood. Rome looked at 13-year-olds and said, "Congratulations, you now have the responsibilities of a 40-year-old senator with none of the salary. You don't grow into adulthood. You are shoved into it like a soldier being tossed into battle before he finishes his breakfast." It starts with the toga ceremony. One morning you're a child running around barefoot, and the next you're being wrapped in the toga virilis, a giant, heavy, overly dramatic bedsheet that signals to the world that you are now a respectable adult. Even though your brain is still firmly in the do-we-have-snacks stage of development, your family beams with pride. Your father pats your back. Your mother wipes her tears. Meanwhile, you're just trying not to trip in front of half the forum and become the main character of Roman gossip for the next decade. If you're a girl, the expectations strike even harder. One morning you're playing with dolls made of clay, and the next your mother says, "Let's talk about marriage." At 13, the age when most modern teenagers struggle to choose a profile picture. In Rome, it's the age where you start thinking about managing a household, selecting good wool, and preparing to raise humans who will eventually yell political opinions at people in the street. Rome didn't believe in finding yourself. Rome believed in assigning you an identity. You're the son of a baker. Congratulations. You're going to be a baker. You're the daughter of a merchant. Fantastic. You're now studying accounting whether you like it or not. And Romans loved responsibility. They loved it so much they gave you responsibilities before you could fully process the word responsibility. Boys were expected to prepare for politics, rhetoric, and possibly military service. Girls learned to run a home, manage finances, direct servants, and ideally avoid starting any scandals, which in Rome was harder than it sounds. Everything you do is judged. Your posture, your manners, your Latin grammar, your clothing, the way you look at someone in public. Rome is a city of professional gossipers. Everyone has an opinion, and none of them are subtle. Even your hobbies are monitored. Are you reading? Good. Are you gambling? Bad. Are you staring at gladiators too long? Depends who saw you. Rome didn't wait for you to mature. Rome demanded maturity immediately and loudly, and in public. If you're a Roman teenage boy, your life comes with a uniform, the toga virilis. And calling it a uniform is generous, because in practice it's a heavy, impractical, uncooperative monster of a garment that seems specifically designed to make you trip in public. The first time you put it on, you suddenly understand why every Roman statue looks stressed. The moment you step outside, the toga begins its slow transformation into an awkward bedsheet with a personal vendetta. It slides off your shoulder. It tangles around your legs. It tries to strangle you during wind gusts. And if it brushes the ground, instant dirt. Rome is dusty, chaotic, and full of mystery liquids you do not want on fabric. But you wear it anyway because it announces to the world, "I am now a man." Even though you're still 13 and still haven't figured out how to hold the toga without looking like you're fighting a sea creature, now that you're officially a man in Roman society again at 13, your responsibilities begin piling up faster than a mora in a wine shop. Your father immediately decides it's time for you to learn the important things: rhetoric, philosophy, law, military, discipline, and how to greet people in public without embarrassing the family. And if you mess up, don't worry. Someone will loudly point it out. Your day includes going to school, a loud outdoor classroom where your teacher insists on reciting the words of great philosophers while ignoring the fishmonger yelling behind him. You spend hours copying Greek passages, memorizing speeches, and practicing arguments. Romans adored arguing. They trained for it like athletes. You learn to debate everything: politics, poetry, architecture, whether your friend's haircut looks stupid, all valid topics. After school, you might accompany your father to the Forum, the beating heart of Rome. Here you observe politics in action, senators lying with conviction, merchants shouting about prices, and public speakers gesturing dramatically enough to accidentally hit bystanders. Your father whispers, "One day this will be you," while you're thinking, "One day, I hope I learn how to walk in this toga." You're also expected to show virtues, Roman courage, and discipline. This includes training your body, practicing with wooden swords, and learning how to march like a tiny, unimpressive legionary. Being a Roman teen boy isn't relaxing. It's a marathon of expectations wrapped in fabric. But hey, at least your sandals are comfortable. Usually, if you're a teenage girl in ancient Rome, your life doesn't gently unfold. It snaps into place like a trap. One moment you're a child playing with dolls made from leftover wool scraps, and the next your mother is saying, "Sweetheart, let's discuss household management and your future husband," while you are still mentally processing yesterday's lesson about spinning flax. Your day starts early, very early, before dawn, because according to Roman mothers, sunlight is optional but productivity is not. You wake to the sounds of the street, vendors shouting, dogs barking, someone dropping a jar for the third morning in a row, and then to the sound of your mother's voice reminding you that adulthood is not going to prepare itself. Your tasks begin immediately. You help with weaving, spinning, cleaning, preparing food, and managing the never-ending Roman laundry cycle. Roman clothing is mostly wool, and wool does not cooperate. You stir vats of hot water, scrub stains, wring tunics with your hands, and silently wonder how many gods must be appeased to invent the future washing machine. If your family is wealthy, your day includes supervising servants and learning how to host elegant dinners. Dinners where guests judge the seating arrangements, the seasoning, the conversation, the decor, and probably your existence. Your mother teaches you how to smile politely, while doing mental math to stretch the household budget. She also teaches you how to avoid family scandal, which in Rome is a full-time occupation because scandal is basically a city sport. If your family is poor, your workload doubles. You help run the family stall at the market, carry away more than you do, bargain with merchants who all believe they are comedic geniuses, and chase your siblings around before they accidentally set something on fire. And on top of all of this, you're expected to prepare for marriage. By 13 or 14, your parents are already assessing potential husbands. Rich, good, respectable family. Better, breath smells like fermented anchovies. Unfortunate but survivable. Love. What is love? A Greek poem? A luxury item? Something only the extremely wealthy can afford? Roman girls learn early to navigate a society built entirely by men who think they know what's best for everyone. Your mother teaches you the real secrets: how to negotiate, how to manage finances, how to quietly run the entire household without any man noticing you're the one doing all the work. Your life is demanding, structured, chaotic, and endlessly busy. And you're only 13. Rome doesn't give you time to grow up. It simply assumes you already have. School in ancient Rome is not the calm academic sanctuary modern people imagine. There are no quiet classrooms, polished hallways, or inspirational posters reminding you to reach for the stars. No, Roman school happens outside in public in full chaos. You're basically trying to learn philosophy in the middle of a farmer's market. Your school day begins when you arrive at the ludus, which is essentially a small space near a street or marketplace. Your teacher, the literator, is already there, sitting with the eternal expression of someone wondering why the gods cursed him with a career involving teenagers. Your classmates gather around the teacher, each armed with a wax tablet, a stylus, and the attention span of a mildly caffeinated squirrel. The street is loud. Children run by. Merchants yell about olives. A stray dog wanders in and decides your wax tablet is a chew toy. Still, your teacher demands absolute concentration. Your lessons include reading, writing, and basic arithmetic. Sound simple, except you're learning Greek and Latin at the same time because Romans decided that their teenagers should suffer academically from two directions at once. You practice forming letters on your wax tablet while your teacher walks around correcting posture, pronunciation, and life choices. Then comes rhetoric. Rhetoric is Rome's favorite subject. Forget math, forget science. Romans believe that if you can argue loudly and convincingly while waving your arms, you can succeed anywhere. You begin practicing small speeches, introductions, simple debates, and dramatic recitations of poetry. Your teacher insists that every line must be delivered with enough passion to move the Senate. Meanwhile, you're just trying not to get distracted by the fishmonger arguing with a customer 3 feet away. If your family can afford it, you later graduate to the Grammaticus, the advanced teacher. Here you study Greek literature, history, geometry, and the correct way to insult someone using heroic vocabulary. You learn the difference between good grammar, elegant grammar, and grammar that will cause Cicero's ghost to slap you. Of course, teachers are strict. They enforce discipline with a stick that has a name, a nicknamed stick. And somehow that is not the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part is the constant expectation that you will grow up to be a well-spoken, well-mannered, socially presentable Roman citizen who does not embarrass the entire household by tripping over their toga during a speech. School in Rome is loud, demanding, chaotic, and yet you learn. Because in ancient Rome, education isn't optional. It's preparation for a life lived in public. And Rome is always watching. By the time you're a teenager, in ancient Rome, the city has already made one thing very clear. You are now useful. Not cute, not growing, not figuring things out. Useful. Rome believes deeply in squeezing productivity out of every human from the moment they can walk without falling into a fountain. If you're from a poor or modest family, your day involves more chores than a modern teenager could survive emotionally. Forget clean your room. You're scrubbing floors, hauling water from a fountain several blocks away, cutting vegetables, feeding animals, weaving cloth, sweeping courtyards, and trying not to inhale too much dust as your brother shakes out rugs from the balcony like he's summoning a sandstorm. Laundry. Congratulations, you get to help, and Roman laundry is not laundry. It's warfare. Clothes are soaked in, tubs stomped on, scrubbed with brushes, rinsed, wrung out, and hung to dry in a way that somehow involves every relative shouting direction simultaneously. And just when you think you're done, your mother appears holding another basket like a disappointed goddess. If you're a boy, chances are you're also apprenticed somewhere, maybe with a blacksmith, where your day consists of being sweaty, soot-covered, and yelled at by a man who speaks exclusively in grunts and hammer noises. Or maybe you're apprenticed to a potter, where your job is to carry heavy clay and try very hard not to break anything because the potter has the patience of a tired bull. If you're a girl, your apprenticeship happens inside the home. You learn weaving, spinning, cooking, budgeting, storage management, and the ancient Roman art of smiling politely while solving everyone's problems quietly. Your mother trains you like a general preparing a commander. One day you will run a household, and she will not let you embarrass the family by mismanaging olive oil supplies. Meanwhile, wealthy teens have chores too. They just involve supervising people doing the actual work. But trust me, Roman supervision is exhausting. You must observe, you must critique, you must nod wisely at appropriate moments, you must pretend to understand, accounting while your father lectures you about grain prices. And if you're extremely wealthy, congratulations. You now have the additional burden of etiquette lessons. Yes, etiquette. You learn how to sit, stand, greet senators, hand objects politely, and avoid committing social crimes like speaking out of turn or wearing the wrong sandals to a festival. No matter your class, Rome expects you to contribute. Teenagers are not ornamental, they are workforce. By 13 or 14, you're not preparing for adult life, you're already living it. Despite the responsibilities, the chores, the expectations, and the constant threat of being yelled at by an adult for reasons you do not fully understand, Roman teenagers still manage to have a social life, a loud social life, a dramatic one. Rome is not a city of quiet friendships. It is a city of friendships forged in chaos. Your friends are the kids you grew up with, neighbors, classmates, cousins, the boy who once threw an amphora into a fountain and blamed it on a dog, and the girl who can negotiate better than half the Senate. Together, you form a small army of teenage energy wandering the streets of the empire's capital. Rome is your playground, and by playground I mean dangerous, crowded, unregulated obstacle course. You dart between carts, avoid stray dogs, dodge unexpected puddles of questionable liquid, and weave around merchants who consider shouting at teenagers a beloved hobby. You meet your friends in the forum, at the bars, or at the nearest food store selling bread, olives, or garam-soaked snacks. Street food is your lifeline. You and your friends eat while discussing vital teenage topics. Which gladiator is the coolest? Whether your rhetoric teacher is secretly cursed and who saw a senator trip over his toga last week, games are a huge part of Roman teen life. You play ball games in cramped courtyards, board games with knucklebones, and 100 chaotic variations of tag that involve rules no adult understands. Boys might wrestle or practice mock combat. Nothing says friendship like trying to tackle your friend into the dirt. Girls socialize through weaving circles, gossip sessions, and occasional moments of peaceful rebellion, like rolling their eyes when adults think they aren't looking. The baths are the ultimate hangout spot. Even teens too broke to afford a proper meal will save a coin or two for entry. Inside you sweat in the hot room, splash in the cold plunge, whisper gossip, brag about your tutors, complain about chores, and pretend to be sophisticated adults while actually behaving like noisy teenagers convinced the steam hides their secrets. Of course, Rome is full of rules, so sneaking out is practically mandatory. Teens slip away to watch chariot races train, to hear street performers practice comedy routines, or to spy on gladiators doing warm-ups. Every outing becomes a mission, complete with dramatic whispering and occasional sprinting when things go wrong. Friendships in Rome are fierce, loyal, loud, and unforgettable. Because when you grow up in a city that never stops moving, shouting, or judging, you cling to the people who understand your chaos. Being a teenager in ancient Rome means one thing above all else. Your outfit is out to destroy you. Roman fashion is not clothing. It is a daily battle between you, gravity, fabric, and public humiliation, and gravity always wins. Let's start with boys. You wake up, put on your tunic, and then the main event. Wrap yourself in the toga virilis, a garment so dramatic, so heavy, so pointlessly large that it could double as a circus tent in an emergency. The toga has exactly two goals in life. One, to signal your transition into adulthood, and two, to trip you in front of someone important. No Roman statue shows the truth. The toga slips. It folds wrong. It develops a mind of its own. If there's a breeze, forget it. You're suddenly doing a full body wrestling match with a sheet while the city watches. Senators make it look elegant because they have slaves adjusting it every 10 minutes. You, on the other hand, are a teenager trying not to collapse into a fabric burrito. Girls have their own fashion challenges. You wear the slur and the parlor, both lovely garments. In theory, in reality, they're long, heavy, and determined to catch on any nearby furniture, doorframe, or passing goat. You tie your hair into elaborate styles that require at least 3 pins, 2 prayers, and the patience of Jupiter himself. And after all that effort, one gust of wind, and you're reinventing the local hairstyle unintentionally. Accessories aren't optional. Jewelry communicates your family's wealth or lack thereof to everyone within a 3B block radius. Earrings, bracelets, brooches. Romans were magpies with social ambition. If you're wealthy, you wear gold and glass beads. If you're poor, you wear bone, clay, or whatever your uncle traded for at the market, hopefully not cursed. Footwear, sandals, of course. Practical in summer, tolerable in spring, regrettable in winter. The straps always break at the worst moment. Always. Usually when you're trying to look dignified or when you need to walk across a suspicious puddle that absolutely did not come from rain. And remember, Rome is judgmental. The entire city is one giant runway and every citizen is a fashion critic. Too plain, suspicious. Too fancy, suspicious. Wrinkled tunic, unforgivable toga touching the ground. You have shamed your ancestors. Roman fashion demands two things, confidence and constant adjusting. You are draped in symbolism, wrapped in social pressure, and tied together with hope. Welcome to ancient Rome, where even your outfit has political meaning and personal vendettas. Stepping outside, your home as a Roman teenager is like entering a live-action obstacle course designed by the gods for their personal entertainment. The streets of Rome are not streets in the modern sense. They are living organisms, loud, unpredictable, dramatic, and absolutely determined to trip you, splash you, confuse you, or convert you to a new religion before lunchtime. The moment you walk outside, the city grabs you by the tunic and shakes you awake. Vendors are already shouting as if they're in a competition to rupture your eardrums. Fresh bread, fresh fish, fresh lies. You learn quickly that everything in Rome is advertised loudly, confidently, and with aggressive eye contact. The smells hit you next. Rome has a scent profile that cannot be captured by science. It is a powerful blend of baked bread, olive oil, incense, sweat, animals, wine, sewage, wood smoke, cooked meat, and whatever your neighbor dumped out of his window 5 minutes ago. Every corner smells different. Every corner smells honest. Navigating the streets is a sport. First, you dodge carts pulled by donkeys who have absolutely zero respect for pedestrians. Then, you sidestep beggars, performers, stray dogs, and children running around like caffeinated lizards. The cobblestones are uneven, the alleys are narrow, and half the population is yelling at the other half. You pass shops lining the streets, tiny businesses bursting with activity. Bakers pull steaming loaves from ovens. Blacksmiths hammer metal so loudly your soul vibrates. Barbers shave customers in full public view. And tavern owners call out tempting offers that imply you will definitely regret the wine later. Street performers are everywhere. Musicians strum lutes. Poets recite verses with the confidence of people who have never been booed before. And acrobats attempt flips that make your mother mutter prayers under her breath. Some are talented, others are enthusiastic. Chariot traffic is a nightmare. If you hear wheels approaching, you move fast, because Roman drivers operate under two rules. 1, speed is life, and 2, pedestrians should pay attention. Teens often sprint out of the way dramatically, pretending afterward that they totally weren't scared. You also encounter soldiers on patrol, walking reminders that Rome is powerful, organized, and constantly watching. They don't smile, they don't wave, they stare like you're one clumsy toga step away from becoming paperwork. And yet, despite the chaos, the smells, the shouting, the near-death experiences, and the constant threat of slipping in something mysterious, the streets of Rome are thrilling. They are alive. They are dangerous. They are unforgettable. And as a Roman teenager, they are your world. If there is one thing Roman teenagers love more than complaining about chores, it's festivals. And ancient Rome has a lot of festivals. Enough that you sometimes wonder if the entire empire is one missed harvest away from becoming a year-long party with occasional tax collections. Festivals in Rome are loud, chaotic, joyful, reckless, and suspiciously lacking in rules, which means teenagers love them. Let's begin with the big one, Saturnalia. For one glorious week in December, Rome flips upside down. Masters serve their slaves, families exchange gifts, gambling becomes socially acceptable, and teenagers are allowed to behave like over-exited goat herders with no adult supervision. You wear bright clothes, shout in the streets, and eat enough sweets to question whether the gods invented diabetes. Then there's Lupercalia, a festival that modern parents would absolutely ban. Teenagers gather to watch half-naked priests run around the city, smacking people with strips of goat, hide for fertility. You pretend you're only watching ironically, but deep down you know everyone your age finds it hilarious and chaotic and slightly concerning. Florelia is another favorite, a spring festival full of flowers, dancing, theatrical performances, and people acting dramatically despite being completely sober. Teenage girls love it for the fashion. Teenage boys love it for reasons they deny when parents ask. Every festival comes with food stalls, performers, music, and the ancient Roman version of carnival chaos. You wander the streets with your friends eating honey cakes or roasted nuts, while street magicians perform tricks that definitely involve cheating but are entertaining anyway. You watch actors perform bawdy comedies in masks so exaggerated they could haunt your dreams. Acrobats flip, musicians play, people dance with abandon. Rome becomes a playground. But festivals aren't the only entertainment. The Colosseum and amphitheaters are magnets for teenagers. You and your friends sneak away to watch gladiators train, muscular warriors, practicing with wooden swords while you pretend you're there for educational purposes. The energy, the cheering, the drama, it's addictive. Your mother says the games are too violent. Your father says they're culturally important. You insist you're just interested in the strategy. Then there's the circus, Maximus, home of chariot racing, the ancient equivalent of Formula One mixed with MMA. Teenagers pick teams, paint symbols on their sandals, and scream themselves hoarse as horses tear around the track at breakneck speed. Winning feels like triumph. Losing feels personal. Festivals and entertainment aren't just pastimes. They're freedom. They're joy. They're the heartbeat of Roman teenage life. If you think Roman bathhouses were quiet, relaxing spa environments where people whispered softly and enjoyed serenity, congratulations. You've never been to Rome. The bathhouse is the beating heart of Roman social life. Loud, crowded, humid, chaotic, and somehow still everyone's favorite place to hang out. As a Roman teenager, the baths are the place to socialize. You and your friends don't say, "Let's meet up later." You say, "Meet me at the baths," because honestly, where else is there to go? The streets are dangerous, the forum is full of adults arguing, and your house is full of chores waiting to ambush you. The baths are neutral territory, a sanctuary of steam and gossip. Entry is cheap, even for poorer families. You hand over a small coin, walk inside, and immediately get hit with a wall of heat that slaps you harder than your rhetoric teacher when you misquote Homer. Inside, it's a maze of rooms. The apoditarium, changing room, tepidarium, warm room, colarium, hot room, and frigidarium, cold plunge. Each one offers a unique experience, none of which involves peace. You strip down in the changing room, hide your belongings in a cubby, and pray the attendant is honest today. Theft is technically illegal, but happens often enough that everyone just pretends it's part of the charm. Then you head into the warm room to let your body adjust, along with 50 other people who had the exact same idea. The hot room is where the magic happens. The steam is so thick you can barely see your own hands. Middle-aged men loudly discuss politics. Elderly men complain about everything. Teenagers whisper gossip so juicy it could collapse the Senate. The heat isn't just warm, it's I can feel my soul sweating warm. Your hair frizzes instantly. Your skin moisturizes whether you want it to or not. Then comes the cold plunge, the Roman version of a dare. You jump in, scream internally, and try not to die of shock while your friends laugh at you. The water is colder than the expression your mother gives you when you try sarcasm. Between dips, you eat snacks, chat, complain about school, admire gladiator posters carved into the walls, and pretend you're not staring at cute people from afar. The bathhouse is the only place where teenagers can relax, socialize, and pretend adulthood isn't sprinting toward them at gladiator speed. The baths aren't just hygiene, they're therapy, they're community. They're the ancient Roman version of a mall, gym, cafe, and gossip hub, all fused into one glorious, sweaty building. If you think modern parents have high expectations, ancient Roman parents would like to have a word. In Rome, family expectations hit you with the force of a runaway chariot, and there is absolutely no escape. You're a teenager, yes, but Rome does not care. Rome believes you are ready, mature, capable, and responsible. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, your family doesn't just hope you'll succeed, they expect it. Because Rome is a society built entirely on reputation. Your family's honor matters more than your comfort, feelings, ambitions, or the fact that your toga is currently trying to kill you. If you're a boy, your father sits you down for the talk. Not the modern version, the Roman version. It goes something like this. Son, you must bring honor to the family. Train your mind, train your body. Learn the law, study rhetoric, observe the forum, and stop slouching. The neighbors can see. Then he gestures dramatically toward the horizon as if the gods themselves are taking notes. Your mother listens nearby, nodding like she's signing off on your future resume. She reminds you that your behavior reflects on the entire household. How you walk, speak, eat, greet people, and even breathe in public must be done with the calculated skill of a miniature senator. If you're a girl, the pressure is even more intense. Your mother takes over your training like a general preparing a commander. You must learn to run a household with smooth efficiency, budgeting, supervising servants, weaving, cleaning, organizing storage, managing guests, maintaining religious rituals, and ensuring the family has enough olive oil to survive the next 10 years. And then there's marriage. Marriage is not a distant idea. It's an active project underway before you've even figured out whether you like poetry or prefer chariot races. Your parents strategize alliances, dowies, and which potential husband has the fewest suspicious rumors attached to him. You sit quietly, nodding politely, while internally screaming. Roman families expect discipline. They expect modesty. They expect achievement. They expect obedience. They expect you to act with the composure of a 45-year-old politician while still shaking sand out of your sandals from yesterday's street games. There is no teenage rebellion in Rome. Not because teenagers don't feel rebellious. They do. But because rebellion ends with a 3-hour lecture on honor, duty, ancestors, Jupiter, and why your behavior might cause drought. Rome doesn't simply raise teenagers. It forges them under pressure, under expectations, under the watching eyes of the entire neighborhood. For all its politics, noise, and questionable smells, ancient Rome still had one universal constant: teenagers developing dramatic crushes that could power an entire amphitheater. Love in Rome is chaotic, inconvenient, thrilling, risky, and absolutely unavoidable, just like everything else in this city. Let's start with the basics. Roman teenagers fall in love fast. You glance across the forum, see someone adjusting their toga without falling, and suddenly you're convinced. The gods have sent you a sign. You spot someone at the baths, their hair perfectly curled, or at least not, completely ruined by steam, and your heart decides this is destiny. Never mind that you've never spoken to them. Details can be sorted out later. Your friends are no help, of course. They encourage everything. You should talk to them. You should write them a poem. You should pretend you need directions even though you've lived here your whole life. Teenage Romans invented bad advice long before the internet. If you're a boy, you attempt to impress your crush through careful techniques such as standing near them awkwardly, gesturing exaggeratedly in conversations they aren't part of, or pretending your toga isn't strangling you. You might try writing a small poetic line inspired by Ovid, except it ends up sounding more like a shopping list with emotions. If you're a girl, things are more complicated. You can't just walk up to someone and say, "Hi," that's scandalous. Instead, you master the art of the sideways glance, subtle, strategic, and devastating. You pass each other in the market, carefully pretending not to notice while absolutely noticing. You exchange shy, smiles while your mothers argue over vegetable prices. Love letters exist, but they're not folded notes passed under desks. They're wax tablets with dramatic expressions like, "Your beauty burns brighter than Vesta's flame," which your parents absolutely should not find lying around. If they do, you'll endure a lecture so long it may span multiple political administrations. Of course, there's always the risk of gossip. Rome is the world capital of gossip. You confide in one friend, and by sunset, the entire neighborhood has opinions on your imaginary romance. Senators gossip, bakers gossip, even the stray dogs probably gossip. And yet, love persists, despite the rules, despite the parents, despite the toga malfunctions, because, even in a city obsessed with duty and honor, Roman teenagers found ways to feel everything intensely, to hope, to dream, to flirt badly, and to imagine futures far bigger than the walls of their family home. In Rome, love isn't private. It's art, it's drama, it's survival, and occasionally a complete disaster. By the time you reach your late teens in ancient Rome, the city has already decided your fate. Not asked. Decided. Rome does not wait for you to discover yourself, find your passion, or figure things out. Rome believes all of that belongs in Greek philosophy classrooms, not your life. You are expected to step into adulthood with the confidence of someone who knows what they're doing, despite the fact that you absolutely do not. If you're a boy, adulthood arrives with a thud. Suddenly, your father drags you to the forum and starts introducing you to people you've never met, but are somehow supposed to impress. Senators, merchants, magistrates, all giving advice you didn't ask for. One pats your shoulder and says, "You must uphold Roman values," and you nod politely, even though you still panic when your toga folds wrong. Your future is a buffet of responsibility: law, politics, military service, or taking over the family business. And just when you think you're ready to choose your path, adults remind you of the other duties: honoring ancestors, maintaining family honor, avoiding scandal, making smart financial decisions, and of course, producing heirs one day. No pressure. If you're a girl, adulthood is even more intense. You don't step, you vault into responsibility. You're expected to run a household with the precision of a military commander. You manage servants, budget resources, organize religious duties, prepare meals, host guests, oversee weaving, and smile gracefully through every crisis the family invents. And then there's marriage. Marriage isn't a romantic journey. It's a strategic alliance, a long-term plan, and the ancient Roman version of "please don't embarrass us." You learn how to navigate your new household with charm, patience, intelligence, and occasionally the quiet rage of someone who hasn't had a day off since childhood. Everyone watches you, everyone judges you, everyone expects greatness, or at least competence, which in Rome is practically the same thing. But here's the surprising part. As overwhelming as adulthood is, Roman teenagers adapt. They rise to the challenge. Yes, they complain quietly. Yes, they panic internally. Yes, they occasionally wish Jupiter would grant them a break. But Rome shapes you. Its noise strengthens you. Its expectations sharpen you. Its chaos prepares you for a life lived proudly in the world's greatest city. You're no longer just a teenager. You're a Roman, an adult in the empire. Ready or not, Rome marches forward and you march with it. In the 12th century, Europe stumbled into one of the strangest cultural inventions in its entire medieval run: courtly love, a system where falling passionately, hopelessly, and mathematically disastrously in love with someone unattainable wasn't a moral failure. It was a flex. Instead of "don't commit adultery," medieval aristocrats invented a loophole: adore someone intensely but never actually touch them. It was romance elevated into a philosophical sport complete with rules, rituals, and an alarming number of poems written by men who probably hadn't showered since Easter. At the heart of courtly love was impossibility. The ideal woman was almost always married, usually to someone powerful, usually much older, and almost always the kind of man who thought poetry was suspiciously French and therefore dangerous. But this obstacle wasn't a bug in the system. It was the engine. A love you already had could never be noble. A love you could never have. That was perfection. Medieval poets insisted that the purest love was the kind that stayed unfulfilled, the kind that tortured you politely while you wrote verses about a woman who might not even know your name. This romance required performance. The knight wasn't supposed to actually seduce the lady. Oh no, that would be crude. Instead, he was meant to worship her like she was an earthly angel, the moral GPS of his soul. He might carry her token into battle, a ribbon, a glove, or sometimes a piece of fabric she definitely didn't know he stole. He would announce his loyalty to her in song in tournaments, even in front of her husband, who was unfortunately often the one sponsoring the tournament. The lady had her own role. She was expected to inspire virtue, correct the knight's behavior with polite cruelty, and reject him with enough grace to make him love her even more. Her job essentially was to be unattainable while pretending she appreciated the effort. In a world where noble women had limited power, this bizarre romantic system accidentally gave them a new kind of influence, the power to make men compete, suffer, improve, or commit mild poetic madness. So, from the very start, courtly love wasn't about kissing or touching or sneaking behind castle walls. It was about longing, weaponized longing, a socially approved heartbreak, a nobleman's excuse to stare at someone else's wife and call it philosophy. To understand courtly love, you have to understand the role of the medieval noblewoman, or rather the myth of her. In theory, she was the moral North Star of the entire aristocratic universe, pure, elegant, wiser than Aristotle, and supposedly blessed with the kind of emotional intelligence that could transform a violent knight into a gentleman simply by looking at him. In reality, she was usually a practical, politically savvy woman managing estates, marriage alliances, household, finances, pregnancies, and the occasional plague outbreak. But medieval poets were not writing about real women. They were writing about the lady, a fictional creature who existed almost entirely in their imagination and occasionally in their saddlebags as an embroidered handkerchief. The pedestalizing was dramatic. Poets described their chosen lady as someone whose beauty could soften the wrath of God, whose smile could tame lions, and whose voice could heal wounds. Real noble women, meanwhile, were busy, making sure the grain harvest didn't get stolen by bandits. But in the romantic fantasy, the woman was a kind of divine force, a muse, a judge, a source of spiritual enlightenment. She wasn't meant to be human so much as symbolic. The lady also became an extremely convenient excuse. Knights claimed that fighting harder in battle wasn't because they wanted glory or loot, but because of her, their bravery, their courtesy, even their personal hygiene. All of it was supposedly in service to a woman they were not allowed to touch. If a knight behaved badly, poets insisted it was because he lacked a guiding lady. If he behaved well, it was because a lady had inspired him. Medieval women were apparently responsible for everything except the weather, but pedestal life had drawbacks. A noble woman being worripped by some knight who wasn't her husband walked a tightrope. If she encouraged him too much, she risked being accused of adultery. If she rejected him too harshly, she violated the rules of courtesy. She had to gently decline his advances while allowing him to continue the emotional melodrama that fueled his poetry. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of being stuck with a persistent admirer while maintaining your reputation, except the admirer shows up in chain. Male reciting metaphors about your eyebrows. Yet, despite the absurdity, this idealization gave noble women an unexpected kind of social gravity in a society that rarely allowed women direct power. Being placed on a pedestal, even an imaginary one, could tilt the world ever so slightly in their favor. If the noble woman was placed on a pedestal, the medieval knight placed himself somewhere far less dignified, usually on his knees, swearing eternal loyalty to someone who could end the whole thing with a single raised eyebrow. In courtly love, the knight's devotion wasn't casual admiration. It was a full-time emotional occupation, complete with rituals, vows, and a level of dramatic suffering that modern audiences would classify as unpaid theater. The knight began by selecting a lady, ideally someone married, socially superior, and as unavailable as humanly possible. This was not a bug, it was the feature. If love was too easy, it wasn't noble. A married woman ensured that the knight's desire remained distant, painful, and most importantly, excellent, material for poetry. He wasn't supposed to win her. He was supposed to long for her in a dignified, courteous agony. He then pledged total obedience to her, which was extremely convenient for poets and extremely awkward for husbands. His vows resembled a strange blend of religious devotion and personal melodrama. He promised to defend her honor, follow her commands, improve himself morally, and if necessary, die gloriously in her name. Ideally, he would avoid actually dying, but the threat of it made the whole thing more poetic. This devotion manifested in everyday life. A knight might carry her colors, a ribbon, a scarf, a piece of fabric she never actually gave him, but which he claimed as a sacred relic. He might perform exceptionally in tournaments, and then publicly declare that his victory belonged entirely to her. If he lost, he blamed himself for failing to be worthy. A surprisingly large number of medieval emotional crises involved knights apologizing to their ladies after getting knocked off a horse at high speed. Longing became a lifestyle. A knight in the courtly love tradition was supposed to be constantly on the brink of emotional collapse, sighing dramatically, composing verses, and gazing pensively at the horizon as if waiting for divine permission to have a conversation with the woman who inspired all this misery. Was it love? Was it self-inflicted emotional chaos? Was it a medieval version of fan culture where the lady didn't know she had a fan club? Maybe a little of all three, but the suffering was essential. Pain proved depth, restraint proved virtue, and the distance between knight and lady, impossible, forbidden, irresistible, was what kept the entire system alive. Courtly love didn't just happen. It came with rules. An entire unwritten constitution that determined how a knight could adore a woman without accidentally creating a scandal large enough to start a feud. Medieval poets and intellectuals treated these rules with a seriousness usually reserved for state treaties or papal decrees. If modern dating had half the structure courtly love demanded, most people would need a lawyer just to send a text. The most famous rulebook came from Andreas Capellanes, a 12th century cleric, whose job apparently included documenting the romantic delusions of the aristocracy. His treatise d'Amour laid out dozens of principles for how noble love was supposed to function. These weren't gentle guidelines. These were rigid, drama-fueling commandments. For example, love cannot exist between husband and wife. Yes, the medieval world officially declared marriage too boring to count as love. If you loved your spouse, you were doing it wrong. The rules emphasized secrecy, which was ironic because half the troubadours in Europe made careers out of gossiping through music about who loved whom. But secrecy preserved dignity, or at least the illusion of it. A knight's devotion had to be private enough to avoid scandal, yet public enough to elevate his social reputation. Quite a tight rope for someone wearing 70% of metal. Another rule, love thrives on difficulty. If things were going well, something was clearly wrong. Obstacles, distance, disapproval, marriage, locked towers, angry husbands with crossbows weren't problems. They were vital ingredients. Without suffering, a knight wasn't truly in love. He was just having a pleasant time, and pleasant times were not poetic. A lady, meanwhile, was required to show mercy without encouragement and firmness without cruelty. Too cold, and she violated courtesy. Too warm, and she violated everything else. Her responses had to be measured in millimeters. Enough kindness to keep the knight devoted, enough restraint to avoid rumors, and enough patience to endure a lifetime of poems comparing her eyebrows to chrysanthemums. Courtly love also demanded moral improvement. A knight had to use his longing to elevate his soul, become more virtuous, more courageous, more refined. If he didn't come out of this emotional circus as a better man, he failed the assignment. So yes, this was romance, but regulated, a passion so carefully choreographed that even adultery had an approved aesthetic. And for better or worse, it shaped medieval Europe's understanding of love for centuries. If courtly love was a cultural fire, then troubadours were the ones running around Europe with torches, happily setting more things ablaze. These poet-musicians of southern France took the raw emotional chaos of noble longing and turned it into the medieval equivalent of chart-topping hits. Imagine a world where every popular song is about someone's hopeless crush on a married noblewoman. That was 12th century Provence. A troubadour's job was part poet, part performer, part gossip columnist. They composed elaborate verses about knights who adored ladies they could never touch, and ladies who inspired knights by refusing to touch them. Their lyrics elevated yearning into an art form. A single sigh from a lady could fuel an entire ballad. A glance from her could fill a whole album. And if she said an actual sentence to the knight, congratulations. That was basically an emotional Grammy. Troubadour helped spread the ideology of courtly love across Europe. Their songs traveled from castle to castle, sometimes carried by the troubadours themselves, sometimes by knights who memorized them, and sometimes by princesses who brought the tradition north when they married foreign kings. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England, was the Beyoncé of courtly love promotion. Thanks to her, the entire aristocracy got hooked on the idea that the highest form of love was basically structured emotional torment. But troubadours didn't just entertain, they shaped reputation. A knight could commission a poet to celebrate his devotion, a medieval PR strategy. A lady could gain social prestige through songs praising her beauty and virtue. On the flip side, a poorly written poem could cause trouble. The troubadour who hinted too strongly at a noblewoman's secret admirer could spark rumors, feuds, or in extreme cases, warfare. Nothing says romantic tension like the risk of accidentally starting a regional conflict. The poetry itself often exaggerated reality to mythical proportions. The knight became a flawless hero, the lady became a goddess, the husband became an obstacle, with a very unfortunate personality. Troubadours used metaphor like seasoning, generously, dramatically, and sometimes nonsensically. A lady's hands were whiter than milk. Her eyes were bright as swords. Her heart was fortified like a strong castle. Real women probably just wanted to supervise their servants in peace. Yet the power of these performers was undeniable. They turned longing into entertainment, secrecy into spectacle, and personal heartbreak into a collective cultural obsession. Without troubadours, courtly love would have remained a niche hobby. With them, it became Europe's most fashionable madness. To understand why courtly love became so wildly popular, you need to understand medieval marriage, or rather the stunning lack of romance inside it. Marriage among the nobility was not about emotion. It was about property, alliances, land rights, heirs, and making sure your neighbor didn't invade you next spring. Feelings were at best irrelevant. At worst, they were a liability. From the moment a noble child was born, their marriage was essentially pre-decided. Families negotiated matches like chess moves. A daughter might be engaged at age 3, married at 12, and running a household before she could legally drink medieval wine without supervision. Her personal preferences not part of the negotiation. Her future husband's personality also not part of the negotiation. If he happened to be twice her age, emotionally unavailable, permanently grumpy, or built like a warrior, that was simply her new reality. For men, the situation wasn't much more romantic. A knight might dream of adventure, glory, or a noble woman who actually smiled at him. Instead, he was told to marry whoever brought the best land deal. Marital affection could happen, of course, but no one counted on it. That was something you got lucky with, like finding an unrated grain store or surviving an arrow wound. So into this emotional desert strode courtly love, a system where nobles were allowed, even encouraged, to feel something as long as it wasn't for their actual spouse. Adultery itself was still officially forbidden, but emotional adultery, that was practically a pastime. A woman could admire a knight who wasn't her husband. A knight could replace marital duty with devotional longing. And all of this was considered culturally refining rather than messy. Courtly love, in a strange way, was the pressure valve of the aristocracy. It made emotional life interesting again. It created drama, excitement, purpose. A noble woman whose marriage was politically necessary rather than fulfilling could enjoy admiration without breaking social rules. A knight stuck in a political marriage could pour his yearning into someone, idealized rather than someone chosen for dowry calculations. The contradiction was astonishing. Medieval society publicly condemned adultery while privately glamorizing a romantic system built entirely around wanting someone you were not allowed to have. But the truth is simple. Courtly love existed precisely because medieval marriage almost never involved romance. When your spouse is assigned like a feudal tax, longing finds someplace else to go, preferably towards someone who makes better poetry. For a system built entirely around desiring someone you weren't supposed to touch, courtly love tiptoed suspiciously close to actual adultery. So close, in fact, that whole armies of clergy, nobles, and irritated husbands spent centuries arguing about where the line was. The official rule was simple. Courtly love must remain pure, untouched, unsullied, wonderfully impossible. The unofficial reality, let's just say that plenty of medieval couples treated the rules as creative guidelines. The whole system rested on a fascinating medieval skill, pretending. A knight could swear lifelong devotion to another man's wife as long as he did so in polished poetry rather than in a dark corridor. A lady could accept his admiration as long as she maintained a tone that said, "I adore your devotion," not "meet me behind the dovecote." In theory, it was emotional theater without physical consequences. But humans are humans, even in the 12th century. And a knight writing 14 poems about a woman's hair was not always satisfied with metaphor. Troubadours didn't help. Their songs blurred lines, hinted at secret rendezvous, and occasionally veered into "we all know what's happening here" territory. Courts buzzed with whispers. Which lady's knight had gotten too bold? Which husband was pretending not to notice? Which poet needed to be exiled for insinuating a bit too much? The fact that so many romances ended with "we will never consummate this love" should tell you everything about how often the opposite occurred. The church predictably hated all of it. Clerics warned that even loving someone in the heart only was a spiritual threat, like adultery performed entirely with sighs. They preached sermons condemning lust disguised as nobility and accused troubadours of spreading moral decay through catchy melodies. Meanwhile, nobles attended these sermons while wearing their lady's ribbon on their sleeve. Husbands had the hardest time. Publicly, they had to act dignified. Courtly love was trendy, after all. Privately, many were furious. Medieval law codes are full of suspicious references to jealous husbands, sudden duels, and cases where a knight accidentally fell out of a window. At the same time, being admired by a famous knight elevated a lady's household prestige, so most husbands swallowed their pride and hoped their wife's courtly admirer stayed in the poetic suffering stage rather than the actual risk of scandal stage. Courtly love balanced on a knife's edge. A love that must look adulterous without becoming adulterous, must inspire desire without fulfilling desire, must burn brightly without catching anything on fire, and somehow, against all logic, it worked most of the time. For something supposedly pure and elevating, courtly love had a spectacular talent for causing absolute chaos. Knights fell in love with the wrong women. Kings grew suspicious. Troubadours spread rumors, and occasionally the entire system escalated into political crisis, open warfare, or a papal meltdown. This was not just poetry. This was geopolitics with better metaphors. Take the famous case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, patron saint of complicated romance. Her court in Poitiers became the medieval equivalent of a romantic think tank filled with troubadours inventing new definitions of love, ladies debating romantic ethics, and noblemen practicing chivalry with a level of enthusiasm that made husbands nervous. Some historians argue that these games of flirtation and song contributed directly to tensions that tore apart her marriage to Louis XVI. When a queen uses emotional devotion as political leverage, Europe pays attention. Or consider Mary de Champagne, who turned courtly love into a moral courtroom. She presided over love trials where nobles debated theoretical romantic dilemmas like can a lady love two men at once. These were intellectual exercises but they shaped attitudes about loyalty, adultery, and power. Ideas have consequences, especially when whispered into royal ears. Then there were the battles sparked by actual physical fairs disguised under the elegant banner of courtly devotion. More than one knight died defending a lady's honor, or at least defending the rumor that he was defending her honor. A nobleman publicly claiming devotion to the wrong woman could trigger family feuds, castle sieges, and long-standing alliances collapsing because someone composed one poem too many. The church, already suspicious of this emotional, free-for-all, doubled down on condemnation when these scandals hit political nerves. Some clerics compared courtly love to heresy, a system where humans worshipped other humans with a devotion that belonged only to God. The idea that a knight could kneel before his lady the way he knelt before the Virgin Mary was spiritually dangerous and politically destabilizing. One bishop even warned that courtly love corrupts kingdoms faster than war. Strong words from a man who probably never had a troubadour write him a ballad. But despite the conflicts, the excommunications, and the occasional funeral involving way too much poetry, courtly love endured. It fed egos, shaped diplomacy, and gave bored nobles something to obsess over between crusades. In a world built on hierarchy and duty, forbidden affection was the one unpredictable spark that could tip everything into motion, sometimes beautifully, sometimes catastrophically. By the time the Middle Ages limped into its final centuries, exhausted by plagues, wars, and increasingly questionable fashion choices, courtly love had already carved its place into European culture. What began as a poetic hobby among southern French aristocrats grew into a continent-spanning phenomenon that reshaped romance, literature, and the way Europeans understood desire itself. And although the system was contradictory, impractical, and occasionally lethal, it left behind a legacy that still echoes today. For one, courtly love invented romantic idealization, the idea that love is ennobling, transformative, and spiritually uplifting. Before this, European literature focused on battles, saints, and biblical disasters. Courtly love introduced something new, interior emotion. Suddenly, poetry wasn't just about slaying enemies or praising God. It was about the agony of longing, the thrill of admiration, and the psychological tornado that occurs when someone beautiful walks past you and ruins your entire week. It also transformed literature forever. From troubadour songs to Critander's Arthurian romances, the emotional tension between forbidden lovers became one of Europe's favorite narrative engines. Think of Lancelot and Guinevere, the ultimate courtly love disaster duo. Their romance wasn't just a subplot, it became a moral earthquake that shook the entire Arthurian world. Authors across Europe devoured the formula. Noble hero, unattainable lady, dangerous longing, tragic consequences. It was the medieval blockbuster template. Even modern romance owes the Middle Ages a debt. The tropes of unrequited love, the beloved placed on a pedestal, the idea that love requires suffering. All of these originated in the same courts where troubadours strummed lutes and noble women pretended they were flattered while mentally planning tomorrow's estate management. Every time a Character size dramatically in a novel or a movie elevates romance into destiny. You're hearing faint echoes of a 12th century poet who rhymed heart with martyr in Occitan. And yet, courtly love was never just an artistic movement. It revealed something profound about medieval society, its hunger for emotion in a world dominated by duty. Nobles lived in a rigid hierarchy bound by arranged marriages and political responsibilities. Courtly love was their escape, a socially approved rebellion that allowed them to feel intensely while pretending they weren't breaking any rules. In the end, this bizarre, beautiful, deeply impractical system became Europe's favorite madness precisely because it made life more dramatic, more poetic, more human. And even now, centuries later, the idea that love must be longed for, not possessed, still lingers, a medieval whisper guiding modern hearts. Victorian medicine had an extraordinary talent. It could turn almost anything a woman did into a medical crisis. Not eating enough, illness; eating too much, illness; feeling tired, illness; feeling energetic, definitely an illness. And if a woman dared to express an opinion or, worse, boredom, anger, or desire, doctors reached for their notebooks like they were documenting an exotic creature discovered in the wild. The era produced some genuine breakthroughs in science, yes, but it also produced an astonishing catalogue of fabricated female disorders that would be laughable if they weren't used to control people. The most infamous of these was hysteria. According to Victorian physicians, nearly anything could trigger it. Too much thinking, too little thinking, riding a horse, reading novels, not wanting children, wanting too many children, or existing for slightly too long in a room without fresh air. Hysteria became the medical Swiss Army knife. It explained everything, which meant it explained nothing, and, crucially, it was almost always diagnosed in women. Men, apparently, were immune, convenient. But hysteria wasn't just a diagnosis. It was a framework, one that medicalized a woman's personality, emotions, frustrations, and desires. If a woman was depressed because she had no legal rights, she was hysterical. If she was angry because her husband treated her like decorative furniture, she was hysterical. If she expressed sexual desire, that was not seen as normal human behavior. It was pathology. And so doctors reached for the only tools they trusted: sedation, isolation, electrotherapy, cold baths, rest cures, and enough lard to tranquilize a horse. Victorians loved the illusion of scientific legitimacy. So instead of admitting that a woman's distress might have social causes, say being trapped in a loveless marriage or being forbidden from education, they turned her suffering into a tidy medical label. And the more medical the label sounded, the easier it was to ignore the real problem. Hysteria made men feel logical, women feel silenced, and society feel justified. Even worse, these diagnoses often hid the truth behind the truth. Desire itself was treated as a malfunction. If a woman wanted intimacy or pleasure, doctors viewed it like a fever that needed cooling, a flame that needed extinguishing. In a world obsessed with moral purity and female obedience, diagnosing women became the perfect tool for policing them. Victorian medicine didn't just treat imagined illnesses, it created them, and thousands of women paid the price for symptoms they never truly had. To understand Victorian medicine, you must understand that it wasn't just medicine, it was morality. Wearing a stethoscope, doctors weren't simply diagnosing illnesses, they were enforcing an entire worldview. They believed society was held together by delicate threads of purity, obedience, and rigid gender roles. And if one woman tugged at those threads, civilization might unravel like a cheap corset. So medicine became a weapon, not intentionally cruel, perhaps, but catastrophically confident. Victorian doctors viewed themselves as guardians of social order. They saw women as naturally fragile, emotional, and constitutionally unsuited for stress, which was convenient because it meant women could be blamed for almost anything while also being excluded from anything important. If a woman wanted education, independence, or control over her own body, doctors insisted these desires were morally dangerous and therefore medically dangerous, and so they invented diagnosis to match. The concept of degeneracy became especially fashionable. This wasn't a real medical condition, it was a fear that society was declining, that modern life was corrupting morals, and that women's desires were the first sign of collapse. A woman who read too much, she risked moral overexcitement. A woman who enjoyed physical exercise, she risked becoming masculinized. A woman who spoke too freely, she risked mental derangement. Everything became a slippery slope into decay. Doctors tied morality to biology with astonishing confidence. They claimed a woman's entire personality was governed by her reproductive system. If she was sad, her uterus was acting up. If she was anxious, her uterus was misaligned. If she was angry, her uterus was wandering around the body looking for trouble. A theory that was outdated even by ancient Greek standards, yet somehow still enjoyed a second life in Victorian Britain. The era also saw extreme anxiety around female sexuality. Desire was portrayed not as natural but as dangerous, a force that could corrupt society, ruin marriages, and weaken men. Doctors wrote solemn warnings that too much pleasure could cause madness, infertility, or moral decay. They recommended sedation, cold baths, and strict supervision to protect both the woman and the world from her impulses. In reality, these diagnoses reflected Victorian fears far more than Victorian bodies. Medicine became the language through which society expressed its panic. Panic about changing gender roles, panic about sexuality, panic about desire itself. And those fears shaped treatments that would soon become even more invasive and far more devastating. If Victorian medicine had a crown jewel, the diagnosis it polished, displayed, and proudly misused, it was hysteria. No condition in history has been diagnosed so frequently with so little evidence. It was vague, elastic, and omnipresent. It covered hundreds of symptoms, and yet none of them were real diseases. It was the perfect medical invention, dramatic enough to justify treatments, broad enough to apply to nearly anyone, and moral enough to reinforce Victorian ideas about what women should be. Doctors described hysteria with the enthusiasm of collectors cataloging butterflies. Symptoms included fainting, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, weeping, daydreaming, a tendency toward rebellion, a desire for independence, and, most suspiciously of all, excessive sexual feeling. In other words, hysteria was everything. Victorian society feared about women wrapped into one convenient label, and because hysteria meant whatever a doctor decided it meant, its diagnosis skyrocketed. Middle-class women, married women, unmarried women, women who worked too much, women who worked too little, nearly every type of woman was considered vulnerable. Meanwhile, men could suffer the same symptoms and simply be described as tired. Part of hysteria's power came from its false scientific aura. Victorian physicians loved the prestige of medical language, and so they borrowed heavily from outdated theories. The ancient Greek belief that a woman's uterus wandered around her body causing trouble, a whimsical bit of medical nonsense even classical writers joked about, resurfaced with a straight face in Victorian textbooks. Doctors earnestly insisted that the female reproductive system was unstable, unpredictable, and capable of causing emotional chaos if not properly controlled. The truth was far simpler. Hysteria was a socially acceptable way to dismiss women's suffering, silence their frustrations, and pathize their desires. If a woman was overwhelmed by the suffocating demands of domestic life, she was hysterical. If she was furious about her lack of legal rights, she was hysterical. If she experienced sexual longing or worse, dissatisfaction, hysteria was both the diagnosis and the warning label. And so treatments were prescribed not to heal but to discipline, sedatives to quiet thoughts, cold baths to restrain impulses, rest, cures to immobilize the body, isolation to curb agitation. all designed to restore the patient to the ideal Victorian woman, quiet, compliant, and unquestioning. Hysteria wasn't medicine. It was a culturally approved eraser, wiping away women's voices while pretending to care for their health. In many cases, the treatment became far more damaging than the so-called disease ever could have been. Of all the treatments Victorian medicine inflicted upon women, none was as infamous or as quietly devastating as the rest cure, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. The rest cure was described as a revolutionary treatment for hysteria, nervousness, female weakness, and any symptom that vaguely resembled unhappiness. In practice, it was psychological imprisonment wrapped in medical respectability. The rest cure prescribed one thing above all else: total inactivity. Patients were confined to bed for weeks or even months. They were forbidden from reading, writing, thinking hard, walking, fresh air, visitors, or anything that might stimulate their minds. Essentially, if it brought joy, exercise, or the slightest mental activity, it was banned. Women were expected to lie still and let their bodies rebuild their nerves, as if the human soul were a broken teacup that just needed a bit of quiet. Doctors believed rest restored feminine delicacy. In reality, it eroded mental stability. Healthy people would suffer under such isolation, but many patients were not healthy to begin with. They came into treatment depressed, anxious, or overwhelmed by domestic life. The rest cure amplified every symptom by stripping them of autonomy. Some women described feeling like prisoners in their own bedrooms. Others wrote later that they felt their identities dissolving day by day. Food was also controlled. Patients were forced to consume heavy, rich diets to restore vitality, sometimes fed by nurses as if they were children. Massage and electrotherapy were performed daily, not for comfort, but because doctors believed inactivity caused muscles to decay. The result was a bizarre routine: eat, be massaged, lie still, obey. The more a woman resisted, the more her resistance was viewed as proof she needed treatment. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper remains the most chilling account of the rest cure's psychological wreckage. Gilman herself underwent Mitchell's treatment, was forbidden to write, and nearly lost her sanity. Her story depicts a woman slowly unraveling as isolation becomes madness, a fictional account rooted in horrifying reality. But the deeper cruelty of the rescue was this: it treated a woman's pain as evidence of her unfitness, her thoughts as symptoms, her creativity as danger, her desires as disorder. It was Victorian morality disguised as medicine, punishing women for outgrowing the roles society had assigned them. It did not cure their suffering, it silenced it. And in that silence, many women broke. If Victorian medicine had a final threat, the shadow lurking behind every prescription, every scolding lecture, every whispered warning, it was the asylum. These institutions were presented as havens of treatment and scientific care, but in reality, they functioned as moral storage rooms, places where inconvenient women could be tucked away with medical justification. A husband, a father, even a brother could request a woman's commitment with breathtaking ease. And once inside, she might never see freedom again. Victorian asylums operated on a chilling principle. If a woman could not perform proper femininity, she was mentally unwell, and proper femininity meant obedience, calmness, modesty, and an astonishing tolerance for boredom. A woman who challenged her husband, refused her duties, sought education, or displayed sexual autonomy could be labeled with a variety of alarming diagnoses: moral insanity, erotomania, melancholic, excitability, or the all-purpose favorite, hysteria. Once a diagnosis was written, no further evidence was needed. Medical authority became a cage. Conditions inside the asylums varied, but many were bleak. Overcrowded wards, poor sanitation, and high mortality rates were common. Treatments included cold water immersion, forced feeding, isolation cells, electrotherapy, and sedatives. That dulled more than distress. Even simple acts, crying, pacing, refusing food, were recorded as proof of illness, rather than reactions to imprisonment. Every behavior became self-confirming evidence that the patient belonged there. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the brutality. It was how ordinary the justifications were. A woman grieving too intensely after a death could be committed. A woman who read too much poetry could be committed. A woman who expressed romantic desire or refused marital relations could be committed. The asylum system blurred the boundary between medicine and morality until the two became indistinguishable. Some women genuinely suffered from severe mental illness, of course, but Victorian treatments rarely helped them. Others were entirely healthy, their incarceration motivated by family, conflict, property disputes, or the inconvenient timing of their emotional lives. The asylum became the ultimate silencing mechanism. And the great irony, male patients with similar behaviors were often treated differently. Men who drank, gambled, or expressed desire were indulged as passionate or high-spirited. Women with those same impulses were degenerating. In the Victorian asylum, science claimed neutrality, but morality held the keys, and behind those locked doors, countless women disappeared into diagnosis that reflected not their minds, but society's fears. If the Victorian asylum was a cage, then sedation was the lock. Chemical method of quieting women whose emotions or desires made society uncomfortable. 19th century doctors had an astonishing enthusiasm for drugs that dulled consciousness. Opium, laudanum, chloral, hydrate, bromides, ether. Substances that today would require medical caution were handed out with the confidence of a man watering plants. She is troublesome, read one medical note, increase her laudanum. The solution to distress wasn't understanding, it was absorption into chemical fog. Sedation was often the first treatment offered for hysteria, anxiety, grief, sexual desire, or simply refusing to smile on command. Victorians treated emotions like medical fires. If a woman burned, too brightly extinguish her, and so women were routinely lulled into half-conscious states where they could neither protest nor participate in their own lives. Doctors insisted this was healing, that sedation calmed the nerves, soothed the spirit, and restored feminine gentleness. In reality, it kept women compliant. Lord was the era's superstar. A mixture of alcohol and opium, it was sold openly innies, recommended by doctors and consumed by mothers, daughters, and even infants. It eased pain, yes, but it also erased restlessness, frustration, anger, and desire, all emotions. Victorian society deemed unseemly in women, many became dependent without anyone recognizing it as addiction. After all, dependency looked very similar to the ideal Victorian woman. Quiet, passive, pliant, chloral hydrate, known as the knockout drops, became another favorite. It was prescribed for insomnia, hysteria, night excitability, and even moral agitation, a phrase that essentially meant she has opinions. The drug induced deep sleep, sometimes dangerously so, and long-term use caused confusion, memory loss, and emotional flattening. Doctors noticed the side effects, but not enough to stop prescribing it. A silent patient was easier to manage than a suffering one. What made these treatments particularly cruel was that they were framed as acts of compassion. A physician might tell a woman, "You must rest for your nerves are overwrought," and then administer a dose strong enough to disable her independence. Family members believed they were helping. Communities believed medicine was advancing, and women disappeared slowly into sedation, their personalities dissolving under the weight of drugs they were told would make them well. Victorian sedation wasn't treatment, it was erasure. Not of illness, but of inconvenience, not of symptoms, but of women's voices. And beneath the quiet surface lay a profound truth. Silence, not health, was the real prescription. No aspect of Victorian medicine reveals its moral agenda more clearly than the way it treated female desire. To 19th century doctors, a woman's sexuality was not part of her humanity. It was a threat, a destabilizing force, a potential gateway to moral collapse, social decay, and what physicians gravely referred to as degenerative tendencies. So instead of acknowledging female desire as natural Victorian medicine, pathized it. A woman who wanted intimacy was not passionate. She was overstimulated. A woman dissatisfied in marriage was not neglected. She was disordered. Sexual desire became a medical emergency. Doctors described female pleasure with near-apocalyptic language. Medical journals warned that excessive passion could cause insanity, infertility, spinal collapse, or even death. Some claimed a woman's body could not physically withstand pleasure without long-term damage, a theory based more on cultural panic than anatomy. The fear of female desire was so intense that doctors treated it with the seriousness of contagious disease. The diagnosis most often applied was nymphomania, a term that covered everything from genuine libido to perfectly normal curiosity. Symptoms included excessive interest in romance, frequent daydreaming, difficulty remaining modest, and inappropriate affection toward one's husband. Yes, Victorian medicine considered enjoying marital intimacy a red flag. Doctors interpreted desire not as an emotion, but as a breakdown of feminine virtue, evidence that a woman's moral center was failing. Treatments were as alarming as the diagnosis. Some women were subjected to forced isolation to cool their passions. Others were prescribed ice baths, sedation, or physical restraints. In the most extreme and disturbing cases, doctors performed clitorectomies, surgical removal of the clitoris, believing it would extinguish desire permanently. These procedures were justified as medical necessity, but they were acts of violence committed under the banner of science. And yet, in a bizarre twist, the same medical world that feared female desire also invented the pelvic massage, a treatment used by some physicians to relieve hysteria by inducing what we now recognize as orgasm. Doctors believed this was purely clinical and not sexual because Victorian morality allowed men to produce pleasure as long as they insisted they didn't understand it. Victorian medicine's approach to desire exposed a deep cultural terror, the fear that women, if allowed autonomy over their bodies, might demand autonomy in every part of life. So sexuality became pathology, pleasure became disease, and the female body became a battlefield between morality and control. For all its obsession with imaginary illnesses, Victorian medicine often failed catastrophically when a woman's suffering was real. Genuine medical conditions, endometriosis, postpartum depression, anemia, chronic pain, infections, autoimmune disorders were routinely dismissed as female nerves or moral weakness. The irony was brutal. The same society that diagnosed women for simply having emotions refused to diagnose them when they were genuinely ill. A woman experiencing crippling menstrual pain might be told she was exaggerating. A woman with chronic fatigue was deemed lazy. A woman suffering complications after childbirth was labeled hysterical instead of treated. Victorian doctors wrote confidently about the female body, yet their knowledge was astonishingly incomplete. Women's anatomy was rarely studied. Women's symptoms rarely believed. Pain was interpreted through the lens of morality. If a woman hurt, it was often assumed she had caused it through impropriety, anxiety, or insufficient obedience. One of the most tragic examples was postpartum depression, which Victorian physicians almost universally misinterpreted as madness. Women experiencing trauma after childbirth were isolated, observed, and sometimes institutionalized. Instead of receiving compassion, they were given cold baths or sedation. Their emotional collapse was seen not as a response to hormonal shifts, exhaustion, or childbirth trauma, but as evidence of failure in feminine duty. Diseases like endometriosis or polycystic ovarian syndrome didn't have names yet. They existed painfully, relentlessly, but doctors lacked both the research and too often the interest to understand them. When women reported symptoms, physicians dismissed them as exaggerations or attention-seeking. Medical texts frequently described women as naturally inclined toward theatrical suffering, and their pain was treated as unreliable, even when it pointed to life-threatening conditions. Tuberculosis, one of the deadliest diseases of the era, affected women in unique ways, but doctors romanticized it instead of treating it. Pale skin, thin bodies, and weakness became the aesthetic of the consumptive beauty. Real suffering became a fashion trend. Women were praised for looking sick, then blamed when they died. Even medical research reflected bias. Experiments were conducted primarily on men. Treatments were based on male physiology. Women were seen not as full subjects, but as variations, weaker, more fragile, morally unpredictable. This meant women's illnesses were often invisible in the medical literature. If something didn't fit the male model, it was pathized, dismissed, or ignored. Victorian medicine was dangerous not only because it invented imaginary diseases, but because it refused to see the real ones. And in the silence created by disbelief, countless women suffered without names for their pain. By the end of the 19th century, Victorian medicine had wrapped itself in the language of science while quietly preserving centuries-old fears about female bodies. And although the era eventually gave way to modern medicine, its shadow still lingers in diagnosis, in culture, and in the subtle ways society treats women's emotions and pain. The ghosts of hysteria, degeneracy, and moral panic didn't vanish. They simply changed vocabulary. For one, the idea that women are more emotional, less rational, or prone to overreaction can be traced directly to Victorian medical texts. These weren't just casual stereotypes. They were published claims by respected physicians, repeated in journals, taught in universities, and absorbed into the foundation of Western medical thinking. As a result, women's pain is still statistically more likely to be dismissed today. Conditions like endometriosis or autoimmune disorders continue to be diagnosed late. Patients reporting pain are still told they're anxious. The echoes are unmistakable. The Victorian fear of female sexuality also left deep marks. Ideas that women should be modest, quiet, or ashamed of their desires didn't begin with the Victorians. But the era medicalized those ideas, wrapping them in scientific authority. Even today, discussions around female pleasure often carry remnants of shame shaped by 19th century morality, disguised as healthcare. Mental health, too, carries residues of this era. Postpartum depression was only formally recognized in the late 20th century, more than 100 years after Victorian. Doctors misinterpreted it as insanity. Anxiety, trauma, and neurodivergence in women were long dismissed because history had framed women's emotions as unreliable. The Victorian assumption that female distress is exaggerated still shapes biases in diagnosis and treatment. The rescuer's legacy appears in subtler ways as well. The idea that women should rest, withdraw, or quiet down when overwhelmed still emerges in how society treats female burnout. The preference for sedating rather than listening persists in stereotypes that brand women as dramatic instead of acknowledging their suffering. Yet there is another legacy, one forged by the women who resisted. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, Elizabeth Packard, and countless unnamed patients pushed back, wrote books, exposed abuses, and forced medicine to confront its failures. Their resistance planted the seeds for reform, for modern psychology, for patient rights, and for the eventual dismantling of hysteria as a diagnosis. Victorian medicine tried to silence women, but in the end, the women it oppressed helped rewrite the story. The legacy is not just the harm done, but the voices that rose to challenge it. Alexander entered the world not quietly, but into a palace already trembling with ambition. His father, Philip II of Macedon, was a man who reshaped kingdoms the way blacksmiths reshape iron. He had taken a fragile, fractured Macedonia and forged it into a rising military titan. His mother, Olympus, was no less formidable, intense, mystical, and fiercely devoted to her son. She told young Alexander that he descended from Achilles, and she said it with the absolute confidence of a woman who expected the world to agree with her. From the very beginning, Alexander lived in a home where power was the household language. Generals marched through the palace like moving statues of iron and leather. Diplomats bowed low, unsure whether they feared Philip more or admired him. Even the servants whispered about omens, victories, and prophecies. Alexander absorbed it all. While other children played with wooden toys, he studied the hardened expressions of veterans returning from campaign. His teachers quickly realized the boy wasn't normal. He asked too many questions, sharp questions, unsettling questions. When told a myth, he demanded the political lesson behind it. When told a battle story, he wanted to know the terrain, the formations, the mistakes. He learned to read faster than expected, but it was the Iliad that became his obsession. Achilles became his imaginary companion, his silent rival, his unreachable standard. He slept with a copy under his pillow and treated the text like scripture. By age 10, Alexander was already demonstrating the iron core of his personality. When his father bought a massive, uncontrollable black stallion named Bucephalus, the palace watched Philip struggle to tame it. The horse reared, kicked, and refused every hand. But Alexander noticed something others didn't. The horse wasn't wild. It was afraid of its own shadow. The boy approached, turned Bucephalus toward the sun, and mounted him as if they were old friends. Philip watched in stunned silence as Alexander guided the beast across the field. "My son," he said afterward, "you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Madonia is too small for you." That moment became legend. But for Alexander, it was simply confirmation of what he already felt pressing inside him, that he wasn't meant for stillness, comfort, or ordinary paths. He was a boy raised on war stories and destiny. And he was already beginning to imagine an empire long before he could grow a beard. At 13, Alexander's education changed from impressive to extraordinary. Philip II, always calculating, decided his heir required more than generals and palace tutors. He needed a mind sharpened by the greatest thinker alive. And so from the cultivated hills of Stera, Aristotle was summoned. Philosopher, scientist, polymath, and a man who had once studied under Plato himself. Bringing Aristotle to teacher Prince was like bringing lightning down from the sky. Alexander was not thrilled at first. He expected a warrior teacher, a strategist, someone who smelled of leather and campfire smoke. Instead, a man in a linen cloak approached with scrolls tucked under his arm. But Aristotle was not soft. His weapon was knowledge, and he wielded it like a spear. On the first day, he asked Alexander a question the boy had never considered. Is it better to conquer the world or understand it? Alexander didn't know there could be a difference. Aristotle built a school for the royal youth at Miaza, a sanctuary of shade and stone in a quiet grove. Here, Alexander and a select circle of companions studied away from the noise of Philip's court. Their days were filled not with drills, but with arguments about ethics, biology, astronomy, logic, and politics. Alexander dissected fish, observed insects, traced the movement of stars, and debated the nature of justice. Under Aristotle, he learned that ruling required more than force. It required thought. But the most profound lessons came from literature. Aristotle guided Alexander through Homer line by line, teaching him not just to worship Achilles, but to analyze him. Courage, Aristotle warned, is not recklessness. Alexander listened, though perhaps not as carefully as Aristotle hoped. He also learned the principles of leadership, persuasion, and statecraft, lessons that would later shape the world's largest empire. Yet beneath the philosophy, something else was brewing. Ambition refined by intellect. Alexander began to see patterns, how empires rose and fell, how people were moved by ideas as much as by armies. The world became a puzzle, and he wanted to solve it. Aristotle didn't try to suppress Alexander's hunger for glory. He tried to discipline it. He taught him to question, to reason, to think beyond impulse. And although Alexander often chafed at limits, he absorbed every lesson. By the end of their time together, Aristotle had done something no general could achieve. He turned Alexander's restless ambition into a theory of greatness. The sword would come later, but the mind was forged here. Aristotle may have shaped Alexander's mind, but the environment at Misa shaped his future army. This was no ordinary classroom. It was a gathering of boys who would one day command battalions, govern cities, and die on distant frontiers under Alexander's banner. Here, friendship and rivalry were forged at the same table, sharpening one another like blades in the same fire. The group included Hephaestion, the quiet, thoughtful boy who would become Alexander's closest companion, the one person who could calm his storms. There was Tommy, observant and clever, who analyzed everything with a future historian's eye. Cassandra, tense and ambitious, watched and calculated. Seleucus, tall and serious, carried himself like someone who already knew he was destined to rule, and Lysimachus, physically strong and bold, often tested Alexander with challenges that bordered on dangerous. Aristotle treated them like young philosophers, not princes or soldiers. Lessons began under the shade of plane trees, where the boys sat cross-legged on the grass listening as Aristotle spoke about logic, ethics, governance, and the natural world. A king, he told them, is only a man who persuades others that he is worth following. Alexander took this to heart and mentally compared it to Philip's belief that a king was whoever had the strongest army. Somewhere between those two philosophies, Alexander began crafting his own definition of leadership. But it wasn't all scrolls and theory. Between lessons, the boys wrestled, raced, climbed trees, and practiced the early forms of military discipline. Even their games were competitive. Who could recite the most lines of Homer? Who could run the fastest? Who could argue Aristotle into a corner? Alexander rarely lost, and when he did, he remembered it. Disagreements sometimes turned into chevs or grapples, but Aristotle encouraged debate rather than punishment. He believed conflict sharpened intellect, and in Alexander's case, sharpened ambition. The prince learned not just to win arguments, but to win loyalty. Even in adolescence, he had the magnetic force of someone others wanted to follow. And while the other boys dreamed of estates, local commands, and comfortable positions, Alexander dreamed of something far greater. He interpreted every lesson, mathematics, poetry, rhetoric, biology, through the lens of conquest. If Aristotle explained the nature of the world, Alexander immediately wondered how that world might be unified. If Aristotle described the differences between cultures, Alexander wondered how those cultures could be brought together under one leader. Mza was not merely a school, it was the seedbed of an empire, and Alexander was already preparing soil for the world he intended to take. While Aristotle was shaping Alexander's mind, Philip II was shaping his body and preparing him for a world where kings survived only by strength and speed. Macedonia was not a place for soft princes. Its hills echoed with hooves, iron, and war songs. Boys became warriors young, and Alexander, heir to the throne, was expected to become more than a warrior. He was expected to become the finest soldier Macedonia had ever produced. Training began before dawn. While mist still clung to the fields, Alexander joined his companions for riding drills, spear practice, and long marches that tested endurance more than muscle. Macedonians fought not as pampered aristocrats, but as hardened frontline troops. Alexander learned to throw the sarissa, the long Macedonian pike that required both strength and coordination. He practiced with the zyos and the copes, mastering the fluid movements necessary for survival in the crush of combat. Physical training wasn't just exercise, it was culture. Macedonia glorified toughness. Even royalty had to sweat, bleed, and prove they could keep pace with common soldiers. Philip often surprised his son's unit with unexpected drills, forcing them to climb steep terrain, cross icy rivers, or endure days of relentless marching. He wanted Alexander to feel discomfort, exhaustion, and fear, and to conquer each one. Alexander never protested. He was driven by something that set him apart, an internal fire to outshine every man, including his father. While other boys collapsed at the end of a march, Alexander kept walking. When horses bucked or reared, Alexander demanded to ride them again. When bruises formed, he treated them like badges. Even Philip noticed his son trained with the focus of someone preparing for battles still decades away. But physical training only fueled Alexander's imagination. As he rode through the hills, he imagined cavalry charges across Asia. When he practiced swordplay, he didn't see Macedonian opponents, he saw Persian immortals. During long marches, he recited lines from the Iliad under his breath, imagining himself fighting beside Achilles on the plain of Troy. His childhood myths were merging with his training. His heroes were becoming models for real ambition. And yet, for all his dreams of conquest, Alexander also learned discipline, the rhythm of command, the importance of formation, the loyalty needed between a leader and his troops. It wasn't just strength he was building, but the foundation of a commander. Every bruise, every drill, every exhausting march was preparing him for the world he intended to claim. Macedonia was training a prince, but Alexander was training to become legend. For most teenagers, mythology is entertainment. For Alexander, it was ancestry. His world was filled with the belief whispered by Olympus, reinforced by priests, rumored among courtiers, that he descended from Achilles on his mother's side and from Heracles on his father's. Whether true or not, Alexander believed it with the certainty of someone who intended to prove it. Myths weren't stories to him, they were blueprints. Olympus cultivated this belief with theatrical devotion. She burned incense, consulted oracles, and surrounded Alexander with the symbolism of heroes. She told him tales of Achilles' speed, Heracles' strength, and Zeus's thunder, not as legends, but as reminders of what blood supposedly flowed through his veins. She wanted him to be extraordinary, and she knew the quickest way to bind a young boy to greatness was to convince him he had been born for it. Alexander absorbed every myth with growing intensity. He treated Homer not as poetry, but as prophecy. He memorized the Iliad, recited passages about honor and destiny, and imagined himself on the fields of Troy. Achilles became his model of excellence, swift in battle, uncompromising in pride, unmatched in glory. But the story also taught him something dangerous. That greatness often comes with loneliness, wrath, and the burden of expectations. Meanwhile, Philip reinforced the other half of his lineage. Heracles, the hero, shaped by labor and strength. Philip never spoke with Olympia's mystical flair, but he embodied the message physically. Greatness, he told Alexander, is earned in sweat, long before it is recognized in battle. He wanted Alexander to believe not in divine privilege, but in discipline. The boy learned early that destiny meant nothing without work, and that even heroes bled. As Alexander grew into adolescence, these two influences collided inside him, Olympia's mystical fire and Philip's practical steel. He began to view himself as someone, standing between worlds, part mortal, part mythic, part student, part warrior. Every victory in training felt like confirmation of prophecy. Every failure felt like defiance of fate. Aristotle added yet another layer, urging Alexander to see heroes not just as warriors, but as moral figures, capable of virtue or ruin. Achilles was great, he warned, but not always wise. It was a reminder that legends can inspire, but also destroy. Alexander listened to all three voices, mother, father, teacher, and deep within he forged a belief that would shape his life. He was destined for greatness, but would have to earn every inch of it. Even while studying under Aristotle and training with his companions, Alexander lived with the constant reminder that his future was not theoretical. Macedonia was surrounded by enemies. Rebellion simmered in the north, and Philip's ambition stretched beyond the horizon. War wasn't a distant concept for Alexander. It was the family business. And as a teenager, he began receiving a front-row seat to its harsh realities. Philip often brought Alexander to military councils where the air smelled of sweat, parchment, and iron. Generals argued over maps scratched in wax, terrain difficulties, tribal politics, and supply routes. Alexander observed quietly at first, absorbing strategies like a sponge, but it didn't take long before he began offering opinions, bold ones. Philip would raise an eyebrow, amused or annoyed depending on the day, but secretly impressed by his son's clarity. War wasn't just discussed, it was practiced. Macedonia constantly fought border tribes like the Urians, Thrians, and Paeonians. Philip allowed Alexander to accompany him on inspections of troops where the boy watched veterans drill in tight formations, their sisses rising like a forest of spears. He learned the importance of discipline, logistics, and the brutal reality that an army was only as strong as the trust between its men, and trust required presence. Alexander didn't act like a prince who stood at a distance. He interacted with the soldiers, asked questions, even joined training drills when Philip wasn't looking. The troops noticed. They respected a boy willing to sweat beside them more than a noble who gave orders from a comfortable seat. But Alexander's education in command wasn't only about strategy or stamina. It was about fear, learning how to control it, shape it, and eventually weaponize it. Philip intentionally exposed him to battle aftermaths, broken shields, wounded men, and funerals for fallen soldiers. Alexander saw the cost of victory before ever commanding a charge. Instead of frightening him, it deepened his resolve. If empires demanded sacrifice, he wanted to understand the price fully. This exposure also awakened the darker, more dangerous part of Alexander's ambition. He became fascinated with how battles could shape entire nations, how one decisive strike could alter the fate of thousands. To him, war was not simply destruction. It was transformation, a tool for building the world he envisioned. By the time he reached his mid-teens, Alexander no longer dreamed of glory in abstract terms. He saw glory as something crafted through strategy, discipline, and relentless bravery. He wasn't just learning how to fight, he was learning how to lead men who would follow him into the unknown. For all his training, learning, and dreaming, nothing shaped teenage Alexander more than the volatile court of Pella. If the battlefield taught him courage, the palace taught him caution. Macedonia's royal court was not a place of calm diplomacy. It was a storm of ambition, alliances, jealousy, and schemes sharp enough to cut a careless prince to pieces. Philip II was a brilliant king, but his brilliance came bundled with unpredictability. His marriages were diplomatic weapons, and each new wife brought new political factions into the palace. Alexander grew up surrounded by half-siblings, rival claimants, and nobles whispering behind tapestries. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone watched the air. Olympias, fiercely protective of her son's claim, warned Alexander constantly. Trust no one who smiles too easily. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival advice. The court saw Alexander not just as a prince, but as a future king with dangerous potential. His intelligence, his charisma, his military promise. These qualities inspired loyalty in some and fear in others. Older generals respected him. Younger nobles envied him. Some hoped to manipulate him. Others hoped he might one day fail. Alexander learned quickly that a king's son must listen more than he speaks. He studied body language the way Aristotle taught him to study biology. He noticed who avoided his gaze, who flattered him too much, who spoke in admiration of his father but never of him. Even as a teenager, he could read a room with unnerving precision. Philip's rivals also watched Alexander carefully. The neighboring city-states, Athens, Thebes, Sparta, knew that if the boy inherited his father's reforms, Macedonia's rise would not slow. Envoys scrutinized Alexander during ceremonies, evaluating whether he was future king material or simply a spirited youth playing at greatness. Alexander made sure to stand tall, speak clearly, and display the poise of someone twice his age. Behind the courtly dances and diplomatic dinners, Alexander's bond with his mother deepened. Olympias fed him conviction. You are destined to rule. But Philip offered a different lesson. Destiny means nothing if the nobles won't follow you. Caught between their philosophies, Alexander learned the truth. Kingship required both divine confidence and political skill. Pella became his first battlefield. Intrigue became his first weapon. Survival became his first test. Before he ever led an army, Alexander learned how to navigate a world where loyalty was fragile, betrayal was common, and every gesture carried political weight. It wasn't the sword that first shaped Alexander into a ruler, it was the palace. Teenage Alexander didn't have to wait long before theory became reality. Macedonia was surrounded by volatile tribes in the north, and rebellions erupted whenever Philip turned his attention elsewhere. In Alexander's mid-teens, one such rebellion flared, and this time Philip was away negotiating abroad. The king needed someone he could trust to keep the kingdom stable. He chose Alexander. The announcement stunned the court. Skeptical nobles muttered that Philip had lost his mind. Alexander was brilliant. Yes, but he was still a boy. Commanding troops against hardened tribesmen was a test even seasoned officers approached cautiously. But Philip didn't hesitate. He wanted to know whether his heir could stand under pressure, whether all the training, philosophy, and drills had forged something real. Alexander seized the opportunity with a mixture of excitement and icy determination. Wearing armor still slightly too large for him, he led the Macedonian cavalry north, accompanied by a handful of experienced commanders who quietly expected to rescue him if things went wrong. They didn't know him yet. He studied the terrain, questioned scouts, and planned ambushes with a strategic clarity that shocked his officers. Alexander didn't fight like a reckless youth. He fought like someone who'd been studying the art of war since he could read, which of course he had. When the Arians attempted to surprise the Macedonians, Alexander struck first. He launched a sudden cavalry assault on their flank, driving them into disarray before they understood they'd lost the element of surprise. Veterans later reported that Alexander moved as though the gods whispered in his ear. In truth, it was years of absorbing Philip's strategies, sharpened by Aristotle's logic and fueled by something more dangerous, Alexander's need to prove himself. The victory was swift and decisive. When Philip returned, he found the rebellion crushed and the border secured. More astonishingly, Alexander's troops adored him. He had fought at the front, shared their hardships, and displayed a level of courage that bordered on reckless brilliance. Philip said nothing at first, but later, according to court rumor, he admitted, privately, "My son seeks victory like a man who thinks it belongs to him." The nobles who had scoffed at Alexander's youth now watched him with new, uneasy respect. For the first time, Macedonia had glimpsed what he might become. And Alexander had tasted something intoxicating, not just glory, but command, and he hungered for more. By the time Alexander approached 17, he was no longer just Philip's son. He was a force the entire Macedonian court had begun to fear, admire, and whisper about. His early victory against the northern tribes had elevated him from gifted youth to legitimate commander. His education under Aristotle had honed his intellect into something sharp and dangerous, and his ambitions, once private fantasies whispered while reading Homer by lamplight, were now visible to anyone who dared to look into his eyes. But greatness, even budding greatness, comes with shadows. The first was Philip himself. Their relationship was complex. Admiration mixed with rivalry, pride mixed with tension. Philip saw in Alexander a reflection, perhaps too accurate a reflection, of his own brilliance. The boy was disciplined, charismatic, stubborn, and born to rule, and Philip, who had clawed his way to power through grit and strategy, sometimes found his son's divine confidence unsettling. At court, nobles sensed this tension and exploited it. Some whispered flattery into Alexander's ear. "You are the true heir. Your father's time is passing." Others whispered doubts. "Philip favors your half-brothers. Watch your back." Alexander learned that political danger often spoke softly. Meanwhile, Olympia intensified her influence. Fiercely protective, she warned Alexander constantly that enemies waited for the moment Philip's attention wavered. She fueled his sense of destiny, but also his fear of betrayal. The combination lit a fire inside him. Ambition edged with paranoia, courage mixed with mistrust. Yet even amid these tensions, Alexander's confidence only grew. He devoured histories, studied battles, and imagined future campaigns in intricate detail. When he looked at the map of the known world, he didn't see borders. He saw starting points. His teenage mind already wandered eastward to Persia, the vast kingdom that had loomed over Greece for more than a century. Most Greeks feared Persia. Alexander studied it the way a hunter studies a lion, but for now he had to remain patient. Philip was preparing the greatest campaign of his life, an invasion of Persia. Alexander would fight in it, perhaps even help lead it. The world was opening, and Alexander felt the universe tightening around him like armor he was born to wear. By 17, he was no longer a student, no longer a boy dreaming in gardens of Maza. He was a commander, an heir, a rising storm sharpening itself against the edges of the world. Everything that made Alexander the Great was already inside him, waiting for the moment history would finally unleash.